Vikings by Stella, Leah, Noah, and Raya.
Vikings and the English language. When you hear the word Viking, a pretty clear image comes to mind. You probably picture a huge guy with a beard and some horns wielding an axe. But who were the Vikings, or Norsemen, really? Where did they come from, and why does the language that we speak, Anglo-Saxon English, seem to have so many Nordic-sounding words? The Vikings were a group of nomadic people from northern Europe and Scandinavia. The name Viking comes from an older Scandinavian word Vikinger, meaning seafarer or pirate. This is a fitting title because the Viking lifestyle consisted of traveling along the coasts of Europe and invading coastal towns and monasteries. It isn't possible at this point to trace the Viking people back to a specific origin, but we do know that the Vikings that famously invaded and raided British Isle monasteries in the 700s and 800s had come from the coasts of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. The first of these Viking invasions happened in 793 off the southeast coast of England. It was documented by the monks of the invaded monastery. This would only be the first of many Viking invasions on British coasts. The first Viking raids on the British Isles were mainly for the sake of treasure. The Vikings were, after all, pirates, and were searching mainly for material wealth. However, after years of these invasions, a Danish army turned up on English shores. But unlike the previous Viking invaders, these Norsemen were armed to conquer. Initially, these Vikings set up a base from which they could easily harass the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The Danes were strong fighters, and now that they had taken control of a piece of British land, they proceeded to plow through the surrounding kingdoms. All but the kingdom of Wessex fell prey to the northern conquerors. Wessex, which was under the rule of King Alfred the Great, was able to fend off the tenacious Norsemen, and their fierce rivalry came to a climax in 878, when Alfred sieged the Danish fortress. This forced the king of the Norsemen, Guthrum, into securing his and his people's lives by promising to stay out of Wessex and additionally being baptized as a Christian. In 886, the two kings agreed to sign a treaty to secure peace between them. The treaty said that Alfred the Great would have control over the south and west of England, while Guthrum would get the north and the east, land which would come to be called the Danelaw, and give the treaty its name, the Danelaw Treaty. And so it was that the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons came to coexist.
As Stella already stated, Vikings signed the Danelaw Treaty in 886, giving them control over the northern half of modern-day England. Vikings progressively stopped their raiding and settled down in England. England became a prime candidate because of the rich soil for agriculture. The Vikings settled more and more land, integrating with the local Anglo-Saxons. Vikings settled in and around towns, setting up different trades. To sell their wares and grains to the local people, Vikings had to communicate with the local Anglo-Saxons. Languages like Old English are extremely difficult for adults to learn, especially for adults who, after the age of 5 years old, are no longer as adept at learning new languages. As Vikings communicated more and more with Anglo-Saxons, they started to speak an imperfect version of English, which lost things like verb endings and gender. The Vikings started to speak this simple English at home and in the marketplace. Because children are the most susceptible to the language, the native children picked up some of the simple English in the market, and Viking children spoke it at home. Intermarriage between Anglo-Saxons and Vikings also led to more and more people learning to speak this simplified English. Vikings were so successful with changing the language because the immigrants came in great numbers. If only a few Vikings had immigrated, the change in grammar and vocab might have been less successful. Linguists predict that all verb conjugation and gender was gone before the Battle of Hastings, which was in the year 1066.
Grammar. These are some Germanic Vikings that conquered Britain. They played a role in influencing some of the grammatical changes seen between Old English and Middle and Modern English. When the Vikings first came to Britain as a conquering force, the natives were still speaking Old English. So that means that the Brits were still using the more complicated version of English that doesn't really look much like what we speak today. Anyways, it looked so different because in Old English, the grammar was more intricate as well as many other aspects of the language. In modern English, what we speak today, we have fairly simple endings. For example, the verb love is conjugated, I love, you love, he, she, or it loves, we love, etc. Super easy, right? Just add an S to the third person conjugation, and you're done. However, about a little less than 2,000 years ago, back in the day when Old English was still being spoken, verbs were much more complicated, and had way more endings happening than just adding an S. Some of the conjugations for love in Old English would look a little like this. I'm not even going to try to say these words, but you get the idea. I mean, Old English just makes me think to myself, wow, it's complicated. As you can see, 1, the words look quite different overall, and 2, the complexity difference between the two conjugations are vastly different. The German that the Vikings brought over to Britain was similar to Old English because German is also pretty intricate. The Vikings' German included grammatical genders, so each noun was dubbed male, female, and neuter. This could get quite confusing. For example, this nice man here can be der Mensch, the man, which is masculine, but he can also be die Person, the person, which is feminine. Weird, right? Same male person, different gendered nouns are used, depending on which noun is decided upon. The native people, however, did not seem to catch on to this idea. Old to Middle English is vastly different, much simpler, and the Vikings could have contributed to that. English was on the brink of changing, and when the Vikings conquered Britain, it essentially just sped up the process of grammar change. Even though the Vikings were much more influential to the native peoples than the native peoples were to them, the native people still had some grammatical input. The influence of the Germanic language stayed, but the native people's lasting work was the vast simplification of German.